The downstream users don't get to weigh in because we're not going through a public process. But that means we can't be negatively impacting those downstream users. And we have to be very careful about that. If we do negatively impact a downstream user by our actions, we could be liable for it. So there's a lot of legal kind of conversations that happen around each transaction. We have to make sure we're not impacting anybody else's water right or water use or property. Building a head gate can change the way the ditch operates. If it changes the way the ditch operates, it's not having a negative impact on someone else's property. So we have to be very cautious about that and engage them in the process. So typically there's a lot more conversation that happens than just between the entities doing the transaction, but the only ones legally contractually involved are the landowner and, in this case, the conservancy.
Can you talk a little bit about how this fits in to maybe more of a river scale, watershed scale approach to doing restoration projects, like how you guys are involved in prioritizing or working, just being more strategic about where these transactions are happening to support restoration or other activities in the watershed?
Yeah, I think it varies in each location. So each watershed that the Conservancy is working in, we're working with a different group of partners. In the Verde, we work very closely with Friends of Verde River Greenway, and obviously that's where I have the most experience. But we work on where we want to focus. We have specific regions that are the lowest flow, and so trying to focus on where can we make the most difference, and what types of transactions we want to do. In the Colorado Basin at a big scale, we're working with partners to say, how do we put more water back in the river that would have otherwise been consumptively used, to think about how to get more water back into the reservoirs to deal with water supply issues downstream. So at each scale, we work with our partners to say, what are the critical issues? Where is riparian restoration occurring? Where can water transactions complement that work? So in the San Pedro Basin, where transactions are occurring, a lot of work has been done to protect the land and to protect that riparian corridor, but without water, that riparian corridor isn't going to last. So how do we work with landowners there to preserve that? So looking at what are those places where we can do transactions. So we do try to coordinate. I do think our coordination could be improved. But I think it's really this working together collaboratively as a group of stakeholders. So hopefully that got a little bit of your answer.
Could you comment on the sort of desired end state of a robust marketplace for water transactions and the concern that Chris outlined in the Colorado Water Plan, not talking about Colorado, on sustaining agriculture and avoiding buy and dry transactions?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. So the Nature Conservancy, I think many of you probably know we like to buy land in the past. We bought a lot of it. We've done a lot of so-called buy and dry. What we really know about that strategy is it's great for that individual piece of land, but it doesn't necessarily solve a watershed problem. So what the Conservancy is really looking at is how do we do water transactions with individual landowners, and those landowners are typically ag producers, and how do we partner with them to make their irrigation water use more efficient, so to maintain the agriculture, to prioritize the lands that they're irrigating. So I don't want to stand up here and say we're never going to take land out of production ever again because it's a bad thing. There are some lands that are pretty marginal farmlands. And oftentimes a farmer is looking at their lands and they're saying, I'm investing this much labor and this much time into 100 acres, and this is my net profit. If I focus more time and effort and resources into my highest productive lands and took these other lands out of production, a farmer can probably maintain their original profits without having the marginal farmland in production. There's a lot of transactions that I'm more familiar with in Oregon, where we work with landowners on creating flexible end dates to the irrigation season. So one in particular in the John Day Basin, we shortened the irrigation season by 35 days. It cut his profits by about 15%, but with that money, he was able to expand his acres and purchase more productive lands that didn't need irrigation. So it worked great for his operation. It also allowed water in the river when salmon were spawning that would have otherwise not been there. So there's got to be a balance between what types of transactions do we do that encourage agriculture to continue, how do we prioritize high value farmlands, and what do we do about some other acreage that's maybe not high value. So balance is, I think, really important. I think for the Conservancy, we're very committed to maintaining agriculture and maintaining the character of the lands that we're working in and the communities that we're part of. So we talked about crop shifting, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, which is a project to grow malt barley to reduce water use. We're putting in 35 acres of carrots on drip irrigation. So the farmer's going to make far more money this year on that 35 acres with carrots than he would have ever made growing marginal alfalfa. He's going to use 2.5 acre feet of water where he used to use about 8. So solutions like that can have a big impact on our streams, but are also incredibly beneficial to the farmer. The farmer would have no ability to invest in that road infrastructure without assistance, and he can't grow carrots where we live without drip. They don't do well on flood. So, having flood irrigation is his only form of irrigation is a barrier to higher use or lower water use crops that have higher yields and higher profits. So I'm trying to create balance.
Hi. Is this on? Okay. Do you find that when you're in a river system where you can actually keep more water in the river, that the downstream junior water rights holders are supportive of your efforts because that will then allow them to have a more consistent supply of water for whatever their needs are?
Yes. So in a river system, where your senior water users are and where your junior water users are really important. So senior water users get the water first, junior water users get what's left over. So if you buy a water right from a junior user and he never got water before, you just wasted your money. If you buy a water right from a senior user, you have to protect it past that junior user. So it really depends on your juniors and your seniors, and so each one of these transactions and markets that we create, each basin, each river has individual challenges based on where your senior users are and your junior users are and who they are. So in the Verde, specifically, the junior users Salt River Project, which provides water to 10 communities in the Phoenix metro area. So they're pretty supportive of getting more water flowing downstream since we can't legally protect it past them. Other communities, there's challenges. I know Colorado has particular challenges around this because if you transact with a senior water use, those return flows that I mentioned, those were coming back into the system and were probably available for those junior users to take. And so if you change the way those water rights are being moved through the system, the return flows might not physically be available to those junior users. So these are not easy transactions to do because you really have to look at where are all the different users. Colorado is very complicated because you have so many different users. In places like Oregon, you have fewer users. Washington, some of those big rural areas where it's still farms and ranches, you have fewer users. And so it's a lot easier to manage where the return flows are and where the diversions are. When you start to have more users, even if they're small users, it gets more complicated. So the small landowners, which it's great to see small landowners investing in ag and starting to use their water rights in beneficial ways. Each one of those users is something you have to manage in these transactions because you're impacting their individual right. So while they might have 1 acre and you're impacting it and there might be 50 of them, that means 50 people are invested in knowing what you're doing with that transaction. And you have to manage a process with 50 people. So the more water users you have in the system, the more complicated the transaction gets. And In 50 users, I'm sure you will find one that's supportive and one that's not, and maybe 20 that have no idea and don't care, and everybody else falls in between. So it can be very, very complicated depending on where your junior user is, if they're supportive or not supportive.
All right, we have time for one more question. If there's one. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
All right, so our final speaker in the water planning innovation session is Karen Schlatter from the Sonora Institute, who will be speaking to us about developing restoration scenarios and outcomes to inform binational water policy in the Colorado River Delta.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, my name is Karen Schlatter. I'm the Adaptive Management Specialist / Monitoring Program Manager for the Colorado River Delta Program at the Sonora Institute. The Sonora Institute is a conservation nonprofit organization that's based in Tucson, Arizona. We primarily do on-the-ground restoration work in the Colorado River Delta in Mexico, but we have other work throughout the West that surrounds community collaboration and finding solutions for communities and environmental issues. I will be presenting today on restoration scenarios that were developed as part of a binational negotiation process for the next agreement between the U.S. and Mexico for the Colorado River Delta. And as you can see from my list of co-authors here, this was very much a collaborative project. A lot of different groups involved, and I'll just mention some of those groups that were part of the core scenario development team. So Predator and the Westing, Sonora Institute, the Nature Conservancy, Universidad de Baja California, the University of Arizona, and the Delta Water Trust, which is also known as Restauremos. And then we had some additional technical support from those folks on the bottom list there. So I'll first provide a little bit of background on the Colorado River Delta, and then I'll get into development of restoration scenarios and more around the binational policy process. So the Colorado River Delta is located in northwestern Mexico. The region in the square there is basically what was the historic delta, but as you can see here on this satellite image on the right, all of that green is an agricultural landscape. So that's mostly what it consists of today, is agricultural farm fields. The Colorado River goes through it, and then the Rio Party is a tributary of the Colorado in Mexico, and there's also a few remnant wetland areas within the delta. Historically, the delta was 2 million acres of riparian and marsh and estuarine habitat. But essentially, since about the mid-1900s, with upstream dams and diversions, the Colorado River stopped flowing to the delta and stopped flowing to the sea, and that resulted in desiccation and degradation of habitat in the delta. And today, I think there's less than 10% of the original habitat remaining. So there's been extensive degradation of habitat in the delta, but despite that, there are remnant wetland areas that have extreme ecological significance. It's located in a very dry area in Mexico, and so even these remnant wetland sites have ecological importance. There's several endangered species that are supported by habitat in the delta. There's a biosphere reserve, 2 Ramsar wetland sites, so it's very important ecologically, and also, over the past 5 years especially, it has gained international significance with the dedication of environmental flows to the region for restoration. So I'll talk a little bit about Minute 319, which was an agreement passed in 2012 by the U.S. and Mexico. It's actually in addition to the 1944 U.S.-Mexico Water Treaty, And it's a landmark agreement because it dedicates water to the river in Mexico for the first time in history. And it's actually the only agreement in the world to date that dedicates water on a binational river for environmental purposes. So really a significant achievement. It's a 5-year term, so it goes from 2013 to 2017. And in addition to providing water to restoration in the Delta, there's a lot of other components involved with it, otherwise it would never have gotten passed. So it provides new guidelines for management of the Colorado River during times of drought. It promotes investments in water conservation as well. And in terms of the amount of flows provided to the Delta within 319, there's a total of 195 million cubic meters. The way that was distributed was about 1/3 of those flows was dedicated as base flows. So these are low magnitude habitat maintenance flows to be dedicated to the Delta over the whole term of Minute 319, so 5-year term. And then the other 2/3 of those flows, 100 million cubic meters, 130 million cubic meters, sorry, was dedicated as a one-time pulse flow release, which occurred in the spring of 2014. How many of you are aware of that release of water? Good. So I talked last year, if you were here, about the vegetation response to that pulse flow release. In addition to the water dedication, a collaboration of NGOs is working to restore 2,300 acres of habitat during that 5-year term as well. And the hope is that we will be renegotiating this agreement at the end of the 5-year term. So if you're not aware, it's 2017, which means the agreement expires at the end of this year. So negotiations are currently ongoing. Which brings me to the next minute, which is termed Minute 32X. It's called Minute 32X because they don't know what number it will be exactly, so they put a generic X at the end. But it's essentially the next water agreement between the U.S. and Mexico. How this process goes is there's a minute negotiation group that's formed of various stakeholders throughout the basin. U.S. Mexican government agencies, tribal groups, various stakeholders, and work groups are created to help solve issues and find solutions to various components that are going on in the basin. So one of those groups is known as the Environmental Work Group. This group is made up of U.S. and Mexican government agencies, NGOs, academic institutions, and water users. And there's a few of the people in this audience are part of that group. Their task is to provide recommendations to the minute negotiating group on specifically restoration and water deliveries to the Delta for environmental purposes. So I'm only going to talk about one specific task that the environmental work group had. They had a bunch of other ones too, but today I'm just going to talk about their work to define restoration scenarios and potential benefits of those scenarios for 4 different water flow volumes. And those flow volumes were given to that group by the minute negotiation group. And the negotiations are still ongoing, so I'm unable to give those volumes to you today, but just to give you a sense, they range from low to high. The lowest is about the amount that would be needed to support habitat that has already been restored in the Delta, and then it ranges up to a high amount that was more than the pulse flow release. So looking at this task, how are we going to develop restoration scenarios for these different environmental flow volumes? Well, probably you're going to need a group of scientists to take on that task. So a sub-team of scientists was formed. Sonoran Institute and others that I mentioned previously got together, had a series of workshops, series of meetings, and then several presentations. And for each scenario, we were tasked to develop define the hydrologic and ecological conditions of the flow releases and then the restoration activities, define that type of environmental enhancement that would occur, and then consider the political and operational limitations when defining those restoration scenarios as well. So given treaty limitations, of course, a group of scientists who wants to restore the delta, we would shoot for the ideal scenario, but we have to work within the boundaries that we have in the Colorado River system, and specifically that international management of water. And then we were tasked to estimate benefits and impacts of those environmental flow deliveries and restoration activities. So the group of scientists got together and we started to define a process. This all occurred early last year, so February to March was when this was happening. So they started working on this task fairly early in the negotiation process. In the subgroup of scientists, we first determined that we needed to set out our restoration priorities for the Delta and then transform those into water delivery priorities. So where are the key areas that we want to restore? Where are conditions currently suitable for restoration? And how can we get the most effective use of flows going forward? And we termed those items our menu items. So these menu items were kind of like packages of restoration goals that could be achieved with one sort of flow volume. And then we went on to estimate the water needs that would be needed for each of those menu items. We also tried to estimate the water balance, so looking at inflows and outflows so that we could potentially use a certain amount of water to meet multiple goals. So maybe we would meet a habitat goal upstream, and by knowing the amount of water that would flow all the way out to the middle part of the delta, for example, we could meet a recreational or a social goal in the middle part of the delta. We also considered interannual variability, which was a great, allowed for a lot more flexibility in designing the restoration scenarios. We could build in potentially more like flood flows in some years and lower flows in other years to get more ecological response. We also incorporated lessons learned from the pulse flow. This was a big part of the development of the scenarios. And then, of course, the limitations that I was previously discussing. And then we determined our methods to quantify and qualify the benefits from the scenarios. So, first of all, we needed to prioritize our water needs. We laid out a number of categories that we could, that were basically our goals for water delivery. So, firstly, we knew we needed to support existing vegetation with the water deliveries. That included restored areas and areas that would be restored by the end of minute 319, and then also areas of remnant native vegetation. We also wanted to create new restored areas, so there was both passive and active restoration potential. And then a big component was including water for recreational flows. This is where the lessons learned from minute 319 comes in. With the delivery of the pulse flow in 2014, one of the big lessons learned was the impact socially was much greater than expected, I think, by the scientific community, and kind of made aware of the scientific community that we really needed to take into consideration environmental flows for not just wildlife and habitat, but also for the communities that live along the river. So that was a big component. And then lastly, we considered trying to achieve components of connectivity and landscape scale restoration. In making this list of our prioritized water needs, we tried to make restoration scenario packages where we could overlap these needs. So, like I was saying, we supported existing vegetation in the area closest to Morelos Dam, at the top of the stretch in Mexico. while we were also supporting a recreational need a little bit further downstream. So we tried to combine and meet needs as much as possible to get an efficient use of water. I'll also note that for the connectivity component, having a continuous surface flow in the Colorado River in Mexico is not an option. So what we did for this component is try to include, to the extent possible, trying to achieve connectivity along the length of sections of the river while also meeting these other goals that we had in mind. So it wasn't a huge priority just because of the unpracticality of connecting the entire length of the river. In terms of thinking about our restoration priorities, we already had conservation priorities defined. This was part of a previous initiative that we developed this map a year before. And you can see here that these areas in the green are actually sites for active restoration potential. There are some areas in the blue close to the top. This is the U.S.-Mexico border. And this is where Morelos Dam is. It's the last dam on the Colorado River. Areas up here where you're more likely to get passive restoration response. So we already had a good idea of our restoration priorities. These were developed based on existing site conditions, data that was collected over the years in the Delta. To get an estimate of water needs for these different restoration goals and social goals, we used a few different tools. For restoring and remnant vegetation, we had estimates of acreages, and then we used evapotranspiration to get an estimate of how much water those habitats would need and would be using on an annual basis. For areas of new passive restoration, again, these are fairly rough calculations done by a group of scientists in about 3 weeks, so we didn't have much time to do this. This whole process could take anywhere from 1 to 2 years if you were to really go for it. We were in a time constraint, so we did what we could. So to estimate water needs for new passive restoration, we used a HEPRES model to predict, how much water would be needed to inundate certain areas and key target restoration sites. Similarly, for recreational purposes, we used HEPRES surface water modeling to estimate the extent of inundation and duration, so where the water would be flowing by riverside communities. So once we had our restoration scenarios developed, we then had to determine the benefits that could be achieved with the restoration. So we took into account several different metrics, and these are all listed at the top of this table, which I'm sure you can't read very well. So I'll list them here as well. So firstly, we tried to estimate the amount of remnant riparian habitat and marsh habitat that would be supported. We estimated restored habitat that would be supported, new habitat that would be restored, the annual long-term water need to maintain that habitat. This isn't so much a benefit, but it was an important consideration for decision makers to know that longer-term water need. We also looked at river connectivity, so to what extent the river would be connected along the length. We also looked at potential for enhancement of the estuary, which is the lowermost region in the Delta. And then we also estimated the annual aquifer recharge. So this is also an important component, particularly in areas where you might be getting high infiltration of water. You're providing recharge. So those are important benefits to consider. With using this type of matrix, we were able to put all of our scenarios side by side and see how they matched up. So we were able to select the most beneficial ecological and social restoration scenarios going forward for each flow volume. Yes, the social benefits. And as you can see from these metrics that we used for each component, Some of them are more specific with an actual number of hectares or acres. Others are more of a range, and that just kind of, it gives you an idea of the level of certainty that we had for each component. So to estimate social benefits, that's rather difficult to do, but we had an idea based on the population centers and the amount of water that would be flowing by population centers, and trying to get a low, medium, high range, which we knew was not, quantitative estimate, but was some sort of estimate. So we also provided a level of confidence here, which is an important part to estimating these benefits, and a great way to communicate to the decision makers our level of confidence in these estimations. In quantifying the benefits, we used a number of tools to get our estimates. So for hydrological models, we used inundation extent and duration under different flow scenarios using the Hecra surface model. We took infiltration estimates to get recharge volumes. We also used a hydrodynamic model that was developed by Mark Stone at the University of New Mexico to look at the level of salinity reduction that could occur under different flow scenarios in the estuary. We used vegetation classification maps that were developed from LiDAR data. Jeff Milliken of the Bureau of Reclamation developed these, and this helped us get an estimation of remnant habitat sites. And then we used estimates of evapotranspiration to get rough estimates of the amount of water that habitat was using. And then, of course, we provided our level of confidence for each estimate. So I'm just going to click through a few slides here to show you some images of the tools that we used. This is an example of our transient headgrass model results. So you can see blue, green, and yellow. These are basically the extent of inundation under some different flow volumes. So using headgrass, we could determine where areas for passive restoration could potentially occur, where areas could have recreational value. These maps are also using the headgrass results, but they're putting restoration on top of that. So we have in the yellow here, it looks kind of green actually on the screen, but the yellow areas are areas of active restoration where we'd be irrigating, planting trees, and removing exotic vegetation. The areas of the blue and the green are potential passive restoration sites. This map shows an example of the canopy scale vegetation map that Jeff Milliken developed from LiDAR. So you can see there's different habitat types, and we're able to group those, get acreages for the amount of habitat, and then estimate evapotranspiration use. This graph shows reduction of salinity with a certain flow volume in the estuary. So using a starting salinity is an issue in the estuary. Basically, there's not freshwater flows to flush out salts that build up over time, and it's detrimental to wildlife. So starting with a 75 parts per thousand salinity in this area of the estuary, we saw that one flow volume could bring it down to below 30 parts per thousand, which was fairly significant. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the results and tools that we used in this process. We did make some assumptions, develop the restoration scenarios, including the use of current groundwater levels, particularly in the upper part of the delta, which is known as the limit trough. Groundwater is currently in decline, so that's an important consideration for going forward with these scenarios. We did assume seepage and evapotranspiration rates, and we assumed current channel geomorphology for some areas and modifications to enhance connectivity in other areas. We also assumed that some water delivery infrastructure needs would be met. So our results were presented to the environmental work group, who then communicated that to the minute negotiation team last spring. And in addition to presenting the restoration scenarios and benefits, We also developed a restoration and monitoring budget, which was presented along with those materials. And so I think I'm actually wearing this exact same outfit in this photo. Time to go shopping. And in summary, also I should note that so the negotiations are still ongoing. We're hoping to conclude them by the end of this year. And I'll wait till questions. I'm sure you guys will have some questions for me about that. But in summary, this is a great example of the use of modeling and data to inform binational water policy. So trying to incorporate what we've learned from experimental flow releases in the past and use that for potential flow releases in the future. In addition, we're combining multiple priorities, so meeting the needs of not only ecological goals, but also social goals going forward with these restoration scenarios. And then, of course, I think it's important with any sort of science that you're doing is to include that level of uncertainty to help communicate to decision makers that this is an ongoing process and this is our best guess at the moment. And I think that is all I have. I have acknowledgments for the actual negotiation group, the environmental work group, and with that, hopefully I have time for a few questions. So thank you.
So you mentioned that you will make judicial transparent using LiDAR data. But for LiDAR data, just measures the heights and not the resolution. So how do you do? And another question regarding mentioned also like estimate for evapotranspiration. So for the trees, which reference ET is used? Thank you very much.
So the LiDAR, the vegetation mapping, Jeff Milliken used LiDAR data and spectral imagery. I didn't include that in here too. He created an algorithm basically to classify habitat based on satellite imagery and the LiDAR data. Yeah. Your second question was, remind me? Oh, yeah, I did have a slide in here, like right before I finalized the presentation, which included a list of references for the evapotranspiration estimates. There was a variety of sources that we pulled from. One that we used pretty heavily was the Lower Colorado River multi-species conservation ET estimates. I'd have to find the exact document, but there are multiple references and sources that we use, and I can send that to you if you're interested. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much. All right, well, that concludes our morning's plenary session. We're going to now take a break. A few things to keep in mind while you are breaking. Make sure you visit our exhibitors who are out here in the lobby. They've got a lot of great informational resources. We have our silent art auction just next door in the adjacent room. Make sure you place your bids today. Also make sure if there is a colleague in the room who you think really is deserving of the First President's Award, that you submit that nomination before the end of this afternoon's break session. And again, we just want to apologize for the construction. If you have any challenges or anything you have questions about, come find us at the registration table and we'll help you with whatever that is. So again, we're going to take a break now, and then we're going to have concurrent sessions. The session Adapting to Change will be in the same room after the break. The other session, we're all in it together, will be in the Legends room, which has some clear signs. You sort of follow this little labyrinth back to my right. So with that, let's take a break and make sure that you are in your session a minute or two before 11:25 so we can get started on time. Thank you.